They came not as an army, but as a shadow that had darkened half the world. The Mongols, conquerors who turned empires to ash, who made kings kneel, who had never truly been stopped. By 1287, their hooves had trampled from Korea to the gates of Europe. They believed Vietnam would fall like all the rest. They believed wrong. Because in the steaming jungles and serpentine rivers of Jai Viet, a prince named Tran Hung Jiao wasn't preparing to defend. He was preparing a trap so perfect, so precisely calculated, that it would swallow the greatest military machine on Earth whole. And what happened at the Bac Dang River in April 1288 would prove that even legends can drown. This wasn't just a battle. This was the moment patience defeated power. This was the day wooden stakes broke an empire. The year was 1287. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, had conquered China and founded the Yuan dynasty. His empire stretched farther than any before it. From his palace in China, he looked south at Vietnam with the same arrogance every conqueror had carried before him: submit or burn. Vietnam had refused before. They had imprisoned his envoys, rejected his demands, and now Kublai was done asking. In late 1287, between 100,000 to 170,000 Yuan soldiers, divided into land forces commanded by Prince Togan and naval forces under Admiral Omar, moved south. Some sources claim the force numbered even higher, perhaps 300,000 when counting tribal auxiliaries, support troops, and the naval crews. The message was clear. Vietnam would kneel, or Vietnam would cease to exist. King Tran Nan Tong stood in his palace at Thung Long and felt the weight of history pressing down. Some at court whispered about surrender. The Mongols had crushed the Song dynasty in China. They had devastated kingdoms across Asia. What chance did a small kingdom have against the storm approaching from the north? Then Prince Tran Hung Jiao stepped forward, not with reassuring lies, not with false hope, but with a promise carved in iron will. In a rousing speech to his forces, he called for national unity and persuaded his army to fight the invaders. His words were fire and venom. He spoke of ancestors who had fought for 1,000 years. He spoke of the shame of kneeling. He spoke of a simple choice: fight or die, but never surrender. And then his men did something that shocked even him. All across the Vietnamese forces, soldiers tattooed their arms with "Sat That," death to the Mongols, not as decoration, as a vow. A promise inked into flesh that said, "We will win or we will die, but we will never be slaves." Those tattoos meant something else too. They meant there was no retreat. The Mongols would execute anyone captured with those words on their arms. By marking themselves, these men had chosen death over surrender. They had made themselves ghosts before the battle even began. The Mongols advanced like they always did, with overwhelming force and terrifying speed. Prince Togan led the land army, while Admiral Omar commanded 500 warships and 70 transports with tens of thousands of sailors. They swept south through multiple routes, a tsunami of steel and horses and fury. On February 3, 1288, they captured Thung Long, the Vietnamese capital. Victory flags rose over the palace. Mongol commanders celebrated. Togan believed the war was already won. But when they entered the city, they found something that would become a pattern, a nightmare that would haunt them for months. Nothing. No food, no supplies, no people, just empty streets and the echo of their own footsteps. The Vietnamese had vanished into the jungle like smoke into wind. And suddenly, the Mongols realized they weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting a land that refused to feed them and a people who refused to appear. This was where Tran Hung Jiao's genius began to show. He adopted guerrilla warfare and scorched earth tactics. The Vietnamese burned their own crops, poisoned their own wells, destroyed bridges, blocked roads. Every step north became a nightmare for Mongol supply lines. Partisan fighters struck from nowhere. A Mongol patrol would march down a jungle path, and Vietnamese arrows would fly from the trees. Soldiers disappeared, supply convoys burned, and the jungle itself seemed to be fighting against them. The heat was unbearable. The diseases were worse. In March 1288, the weather turned hot and humid, making the enemy army sick and seriously weakened. Soldiers who had conquered the steppes of Russia were dying from tropical fevers. Warriors who had burned Baghdad were being devoured by the Vietnamese climate. Still, Togan held the capital. He sent his forces fanning out across the Red River Delta, pillaging crops, trying to resupply. But the Yuan army was large and unsustainable, waiting desperately for their supply fleet commanded by Zhang Wenhu. That supply fleet never made it. In late January, Prince Hung Jiao, with 30 warships, ambushed Zhang's fleet at Vandon Isle, inflicting massive damage and forcing it back to Hainan Island. The Mongols didn't just lose ships, they lost food. And without food, even the greatest army becomes desperate. By March, Togan faced the truth. They couldn't stay. They couldn't fight. They had to retreat. On March 5th, Togan left Hanoi and retreated to the Yuan base at Van Keep. 25 days later, as food supplies ran critically low, he ordered the full withdrawal back to China. The Mongols thought they were escaping. They had no idea they were walking into history's most perfectly designed execution. For months, Prince Tran Hung Jiao had been preparing. While the Mongols celebrated in Thung Long, while they pillaged the countryside, while they grew weaker and hungrier, he had been planning. He studied the tidal patterns of the Bac Dang River and ordered thousands of iron-tipped wooden stakes to be planted beneath the water. The Bac Dang River, the same river where Vietnamese forces had defeated Chinese invaders 350 years earlier in 938. History was about to repeat itself, but on a scale never seen before. The stakes were 1.5 to 3 meters long, dark brown ironwood. They were fixed when the tide was down, spaced 0.9 to 1.2 meters apart. Some stood straight up. Others were inclined at 45-degree angles to target boats moving near the riverbanks. The stakes were planted in the Chan, Ken, and Root rivers, all northern distributaries of the Bac Dang. And hidden behind reefs and bends, Vietnamese forces waited, small flotillas of boats, thousands of soldiers on the banks, fire rafts ready to burn. All they needed now was for the Mongols to come. On April 9, 1288, the Mongol fleet appeared. Admiral Omar, commanding the naval forces and escorted by infantry, fled home along the Bac Dang River. Hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers, all desperate to reach safety in China. The tide was high. The river looked deep, safe, perfect for escape. Omar saw the open water before him and gave the order to advance. His massive fleet pushed forward eagerly. Then came the moment that changed everything. A small Vietnamese fleet appeared from behind the reefs. They attacked briefly, shooting arrows, shouting challenges. Then they turned and fled upriver. The Mongols, hungry for revenge after months of humiliation, took the bait. The Vietnamese junks sailed and retreated, and the Yuan fleet pursued. Omar's warships surged forward, heavy and fast, chasing what they thought was a fleeing, defeated enemy. That's when Tran Hung Jiao did something the Mongols never expected. He waited. He let them chase deeper, Let them push farther into the river. Let their confidence grow with every meter. And all the while, beneath the surface, invisible beneath the high tide, thousands of iron-tipped stakes waited like teeth. The Mongol commanders urged their ships forward. They could almost taste victory. Just a little farther. Just catch those fleeing Vietnamese boats and end this nightmare. Then the river betrayed them. The tide turned, and suddenly those hidden stakes began to rise through the water like the fingers of death reaching up from the riverbed. The first Mongol ship struck with a sound like thunder splitting wood. The hull tore open. Water rushed in. Then another ship hit. Then another. 100 ships sank immediately, impaled on the iron-tipped stakes, while 400 others were captured as the tide ebbed. The water turned red. Ships crashed into each other in panic. Sailors screamed. The organized retreat became chaos, then terror, then massacre. The Vietnamese junks returned and destroyed the immobilized UN warships. No longer fleeing, they attacked with savage precision. Arrows rained down on trapped ships. Fire rafts rushed toward them, and Mongol vessels burst into flames. Soldiers jumped overboard to escape the burning ships, only to find themselves trapped between the stakes. Their armor, so effective on land, became death weights in water. Men drowned by the hundreds, pulled down by the very protection that had made them invincible on the battlefield. Admiral Omar, the highly reputed naval commander who had led fleets in the conquest of the Song dynasty, was captured. The symbol of Mongol naval dominance was now a prisoner of the people Kublai Khan had believed would kneel. On the riverbanks, Vietnamese forces emerged from concealed positions. Mongol troops who jumped ashore were dealt heavy blows by a large army led by King Tran Nan Tong and Tran Hung Jiao. There was no escape, no mercy, just the promise fulfilled. Prince Tran Hung Jiao had positioned his troops with their backs to the river, forcing them to swear to defeat the Mongols or die trying. Those men with "Death to the Mongols" tattooed on their arms now made that promise real. They fought not like soldiers seeking victory, but like men fulfilling a sacred vow. The Mongol fleet, once 500 ships strong, was annihilated. In just one day, more than 600 warships and about 6,000 enemy troops were completely destroyed. When news reached Prince Togan with the land army, he panicked. His escape route was cut, his supplies were gone, his fleet was destroyed. Vietnamese troops made continuous attacks and smashed Togan's army to pieces during their withdrawal through Lang Son. Togan risked his life making a shortcut through forests to flee home. The prince, who had confidently invaded with hundreds of thousands, now ran like a hunted animal through the jungle. Only a handful of Mongol troops survived the retreat to China. The victory was total. The humiliation was complete. When Kublai Khan heard the news, he raged. He angrily banished his son Togan to Yangzhou for life. The prince, who was supposed to conquer Vietnam, never commanded troops again. The emperor wanted revenge. He began planning a fourth invasion, gathering troops, building more ships. But before he could launch it, death came for him instead. Kublai Khan died in 1294, and with him died the Mongol dream of conquering Vietnam. Vietnam was the only place where the Mongols were defeated militarily. The empire that had crushed China, devastated Russia, and terrorized Europe had been broken by wooden stakes and Vietnamese determination. The lesson echoed across centuries. Technology matters. Numbers matter. But knowing your land, fighting for your home, and having the patience to turn geography into a weapon, that matters more. Eventually, King Trần Hoàn Tông agreed to a nominal tributary relationship with the Yuan dynasty to avoid further conflict. Vietnam would send token tribute, acknowledge Yuan authority on paper. But everyone knew the truth. The Mongols had been broken. They would never return. The wooden stakes became legend. In 1976, archaeologists discovered the actual Bac Dang stakes in Chan River, Yen Hung District, dark brown ironwood, 1.5 to 3 meters long, still showing the fissures from water corrosion after 700 years. Physical proof of the day patients defeated power. Prince Tran Hung Jiao became more than a general. He became a god. His portrait was worshipped in temples. His military writings became classics, studied for centuries. And his strategy, guerrilla warfare, scorched earth, using terrain as a weapon, would inspire Vietnamese resistance for generations to come. When French colonial forces invaded Vietnam in the 19th century, they studied the Battle of Bac Dang. When American forces arrived in the 1960s, Vietnamese commanders like Vo Nguyen Giap explicitly used Tran Hung Jiao's tactics. The ghost of Bac Dang haunted every foreign army that tried to conquer Vietnam. Because Bac Dang wasn't just a battle, it was a statement written in water and blood and wood. Some lands cannot be conquered. Some peoples will never kneel. And sometimes the greatest military force in history isn't enough against an enemy who knows exactly when the tide will turn. The Mongols had cavalry that could cross continents. They had composite bows that could darken the sky. They had conquered more territory than any empire before them. But Vietnam had rivers, and patience, and stakes hidden beneath dark water, and men willing to tattoo death to the Mongols on their arms and mean it with every breath. When the tide turned on April 9th, 1288, it didn't just turn for one battle, it turned for history. The invincible had been defeated, the unstoppable had been drowned. And a small kingdom had proven that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't strength. It's knowing your enemy will eventually have to come to you. And when they do, you make sure the tide is on your side.